If you're wondering why the society you've lived in all your life feels as if it's being pulled from under you like a rug, it's because while you weren't paying attention, your wholesome values were quietly reclassified as ugly prejudices, and now you are the problem. You believe in free speech? No, you believe in hate speech, and now you're a criminal. You like democratic sovereignty? Then you're a xenophobe and a fascist. No platform for you. You want a secular society, you Islamophobic racist? You're spreading hate, and you better be using the right pronoun too, if you don't want to be excluded for the sake of inclusion. In short, there's no place for you or your kind in the bright new tomorrow we're building. Now that the minds of an entire generation have been thoroughly rinsed through a progressive education that hates Western culture and everything it stands for, and everything that you hold dear, there's been a climate change that you didn't see coming. The climate has changed against you and your privilege, and without wishing to put too fine a point on it, your presence is no longer required. The best way to destroy the foundations of a society is to teach its young people not to respect them. And a whole generation has now been successfully taught not to value free speech, the very cornerstone of our civilization, but to hold it in contempt and to fear it, to run from it, to seek refuge from ideas in emotional safe spaces, and to believe that hurting somebody's feelings is a form of assault on a par with cracking their skull. This tyranny of feelings has been carefully nurtured to breed this infantile generation of emotional casualties, victims and crybabies, this generation of moral and political half-wits who can't wait to sign the next petition to shut somebody up or shut somebody down, never thinking for a moment that it could ever happen to them. A generation so placidly happy to saw off the branch they're sitting on, it's almost as if they've been programmed in some way. So if you think that you've got the truth on your side, you don't know what you're up against. The truth is incorrect and therefore inadmissible. If you think that you've got the law on your side, forget it. The law protects feelings now, but not your feelings. Your feelings are hate. Well, what about your right to free expression under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, you ask? Optimistically. Nice try, but we both know that in the real world, human rights don't apply to the wrong opinions. Are you crazy? The wrong opinions are hate. You need to understand that when breeding the perfect captive society of self-policing petty censors, you can't afford to let somebody just come along and undermine it with a rational argument. So feelings outrank rational argument now. You probably noticed that when you were banned from social media. And rational argument, when it hurts somebody's feelings, is, you've guessed it, hate. You see, progressive moral righteousness can make up these rules as it goes along, because it's got itself on its side. So really, you can't win. They won't even listen to your arguments as they beat you down with their phony buzzwords. It's not about arguments or ideas anymore. That debate is illegitimate. It's about you being a racist monster, causing division and spreading hate. And it's about dangerous fascist throwbacks like you being aggressively purged from our society like a cancer. Just so you know what you're dealing with here, welcome to Progressive Utopia. If you aspire to be politically progressive but often find yourself feeling intolerably tolerant or unreasonably reasonable, let me help you out with some basic tips. Now, the number one rule, and the only one that you really need to remember, is that all progressive roads lead to racism. You should always look for the racist angle, and if there isn't one, invent one. Show some initiative. So, for example, make sure you frame all serious discussion about democracy in Europe falsely and maliciously in terms of race, and that way you can do your bit to help neutralize the democratic franchise of all future generations, which, if nothing else, will be something to tell your grandchildren, if you can face them. The real question to ask is, how committed are you? How much iron do you have in your soul? To be truly progressive requires a crisp enthusiasm for severe moral judgment that inevitably appeals to the kind of inadequate yet self-consciously superior mentality that thinks it knows best for everyone. Is this you? Do you feel an overwhelming urge to censor the thoughts and opinions of others, to police the language as if you own it, and to make ordinary decent people feel that they need to apologise for their opinions when you know in your heart that it's you who should be apologising for your shameless double standards? For example, as a progressive, you will of course be scrupulously non-judgmental about other cultures, however depraved and disgusting their practices may be, but being a natural hypocrite, you'll be very judgmental indeed about your own culture, which you despise because you despise yourself, and, to be fair, with good reason. On the rare occasions when you can't blame a social or political problem on Western imperialism or racism, however hard you try, for example, when organised gangs of Pakistani Muslims systematically rape and abuse thousands of children over many years because a bunch of progressives in authority allowed them to, then it's nobody's fault. Above all, we mustn't rock the cultural boat. It's more inclusive to let people blow holes in the boat and pretend it isn't happening. So don't trouble yourself in the slightest that women's rights are now negotiable in our society, because we've got so much respect for the cultural difference misogyny represents. As long as it's the correct culture, obviously, and that's usually determined by skin colour, to avoid being racist. You see, the very last thing you can afford as a progressive is to be seen as a racist. In fact, so important is it that it's perfectly okay to be a racist in order not to be seen as a racist by other progressive racists. Also, as a progressive, you are, of course, innately authoritarian, but from a sheltered and cowardly perspective, which makes you a natural banhammer. So you should always be signing self-righteous petitions to get somebody banned or to shut somebody up because you're afraid of their opinions. It goes without saying that anyone arguing for secular democracy, freedom of speech, gender equality, or genuine human rights of any kind is a racist troublemaker who needs to be silenced. You'll find hysterical denunciation is the ideal tool for this purpose. Keep it sharp and keep it handy, because you will need it if you're serious about imposing the correct opinions on people. It's particularly useful in tandem with the word racist, of course. So if somebody is arguing for dangerous ideas like democracy or free speech, which, let's face it, are responsible for all the bad things in this world, you can quickly put a stop to it by throwing in the word racist to stigmatise them, to poison their argument, and to discourage people from listening to what they're actually saying. It's a wonderful way to muddy things up and create prejudice against somebody before they've opened their mouth. And of course it saves you the trouble of having to listen to their infuriatingly sane and sensible arguments, which is always a bonus for any progressive. Also, you'll be happy to know that the apparent mindless straitjacket rigidity of political correctness is curiously liberating, as it transcends any need to think in terms of right and wrong, which is a subject that can be quite taxing if you apply yourself to it. But as a progressive, you don't need to worry about that. You're above right and wrong in the way that a Muslim hate preacher is above the law. So you can devote more of your time to misrepresenting the truth if it's incorrect, slandering those who speak it, and poisoning people's minds against it, in the way that your mind has been poisoned. Take what you've been given and pay it forward. And remember, when you're imposing tolerance and respect on people, there's no need to actually show them any. Just keep throwing mud until it sticks, because you're up to your neck in double standards here. So you need to be extra vigilant against unwelcome opinion, which in your position can be more than inconvenient, as if that wasn't outrageous enough. It can be downright threatening. So anyone attempting to stir up healthy, rational debate should always be swiftly marginalised and crushed in a spirit of reconciliation and healing. And if your conscience troubles you, just remind yourself that you're doing the wrong thing for the correct reason, and you'll be fine. Now, if you're a true progressive, you get all this. You live and breathe this stuff every day. I'm talking here for the benefit of new progressives who might still be struggling with full commitment to the dark side. And I can see why some of you might be wavering. This stuff might seem counterintuitive to you. Some of it might seem downright evil. But don't let yourself be emotionally blackmailed by those imposters, right and wrong. Those are the old values, and old values are inherently patriarchal, racist and sexist, as we all know. Bright, progressive, relativist new values are all about equality, fairness and diversity. So even when they're transparently hypocritical, repressive and false, they're better. And that's really all you need to know. And if your conscience is still troubling you, then your conscience is incorrect and is probably a racist. You know, people have said to me, you could go a little easier on progressives. You won't change anyone's mind by insulting them. And that may be true, but you won't change their mind by not insulting them either. So what's the difference? Talking politics with a progressive is like talking religion with a Jehovah's Witness. If you don't play it for laughs, it will drive you up the wall. Because progressives only hear what they want to hear and what they are determined to hear, regardless of what is actually being said. However clearly and unambiguously you argue for secularism or democracy or free speech or any other civilized value, progressives will hear prejudice, hatred, xenophobia and racism, especially racism, because it's what they need to hear. Otherwise they'd have to address the arguments and expose their shameless double standards. This way they can simply attack your character, which is of course what they always do. And these people shouldn't be insulted. What else is there? If you want to insult a progressive, and frankly I've yet to meet anyone outside the progressive bubble who doesn't, then you probably know already that a good way to do it is to tell them the truth when the truth is incorrect. It really is the ultimate affront. And obviously the more incorrect the better. That's if you feel like a bit of sport, because often they'll struggle even to process the information. So childishly committed are progressives to believing what they think should be the truth, but isn't and never will be. So for example, oh, and by the way, trigger warning progressives, you might want to adopt the standard procedure at this point and put your fingers in your ears, if you haven't already. You could start by pointing out to them that all cultures are not equal, that they're not even close to being equal, and that only somebody who's been hypnotized would think they were. You could then add that it's perfectly possible for black and brown-skinned people to be racist. They'll hate this because to progressives, if somebody has a darker skin tone, then all criticism of anything they say or do is a far-right hate crime, especially if they speak or behave in a way that invites ridicule and contempt. Another good way to get the progressive dander up is to tell them that nobody has the right to censor anyone else's opinion, however hurt their feelings might be. Now, progressives will really hate this one, because they are more inclined than anyone outside religion to believe that your thoughts and opinions are subject to their moral jurisdiction. So whereas a normal person may disagree with your views, a progressive will disapprove of them. And for progressives, it's never enough to simply disapprove of a thing. It must be banned. You must be silenced. And when you're not silenced, it really does seem to annoy them. So it's always worth rubbing it in whenever you can. Another good way to insult these pseudo-liberal plunkers, no offence, is to tell them that opposing a federal dictatorship in Europe has nothing to do with racism or xenophobia, and that only a malicious and paranoid mind would think otherwise. That should get their malicious and paranoid minds in the highest of dudgeon. But if you really want to get these self-righteous half-wits apoplectic with fury, then simply point to the Middle East and tell them that the so-called Palestinian problem is self-created and driven entirely by crude Arab, Muslim, Jew hatred as mandated by Scripture. For a bit more spice, you could add that Israel is not an apartheid state, unlike some of its uncivilized neighbours, and that the BDS movement is a poisonous cultural terrorist group full of rancid, anti-Semitic, left-wing fascists. And that is putting it kindly. Of course, with the religion of special needs, anything you say can potentially insult progressives, as blaming Islam for anything at all is out of the question. However, since Islam is so clearly to blame for so much, this creates the kind of cognitive dissonance in progressives that we typically associate with religious believers. When reality can't be squared with dogma, they somehow end up believing both and seeing no contradiction. So progressives can see very well that Islam is a massive problem in the West, but it can't be, so it isn't. Tra-la-la-la-la. It's such an unfortunate mental condition, it's hard not to sympathise, but luckily not impossible. So you could start by telling them bluntly that Islam is unwelcome in the West because Muslims have made it unwelcome and because progressive PC dipshits like them have helped them do it. You could add that Islam is a serious threat to everyone's freedom, especially if they're female or Jewish or gay, and that it has brought absolutely nothing of value to Western society. All it has done is take and complain and cause trouble, and it has made us less tolerant, less civilized, less safe, and less free. And that if our society is to survive with its core values intact, freedom of speech, freedom of identity, and lots of other essential, healthy, civilized freedoms, then Islam needs to be vigorously and specifically legislated out of all public influence in all Western countries permanently, for the sake of tolerance and diversity and respect. Oh, and don't forget to mention that the fraudulent propaganda term Islamophobia is not a real word. It represents no phenomenon of any significance, and anyone using it is a traitor to humanity. That should just about do it. Now, of course, if you say these things, you will instantly bring down a torrent of slanderous abuse on your head, but relax, that's part and parcel of dealing with progressives. You'll quickly find out that abuse is all they've got, and when you think of the desperate culture of denial and the abject moral vacuum it's coming from, it's hard to imagine a higher compliment or a more spectacular endorsement. One of the few certainties in this life is that if you criticize the religion of special needs, you will be called a racist by people who know perfectly well that you're not, but who don't care. These people are called progressives. A progressive is what happens when a liberal goes bad. So bad, in fact, and so desperate are they to assume that you're a racist, that if they can't find any evidence of it, they will actually accuse you of disguising your racism by not talking about it. I wish I was joking. Believe me, I'm not. Now, personally, I can stand being called ugly names by people whose opinions I don't respect. But it must be hard for victims of genuine racism to see such an important word soiled and devalued like this. But that is the progressive way. We know this now. We've learned it the hard way. We know that progressives occupy the high moral ground where the end always justifies the means. And as they've shown us time and again, there is literally no limit to how low they're prepared to sink in asserting their lofty moral superiority. No lie is too great, no slur too egregious, and if not for double standards, they wouldn't have any standards. So when they throw the word racist at those of us who criticize Islam, we know there's no point in arguing with them about definitions, because we know they're not remotely interested in whether the word is appropriate, only in whether it will stick and in how much damage it will do. You see, in progressive hands, the word racist has become the verbal equivalent of a chemical weapon or a dumb bullet, used spitefully, disproportionately, as a first resort and without the slightest justification. To summarise the progressive position without the juvenile insults, all religions have fundamentalists and all are equally reprehensible. Singling out Islam is the same as attacking all Muslims, and that's racist. Yes, I know that technically Islam is not a race, but I've chosen to believe that your views are driven by an underlying hatred of brown-skinned people, for which I have no evidence, but I sense it from your tone, which I find unhelpful and therefore racist in intent. So you are a racist and you ought to be arrested, la 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 la, or words to that effect. But you know, it seems to me that the people who constantly invoke skin colour for no reason, as progressives do, to the point of obsession, are the ones who actually have a problem with it. They see racism everywhere because they're riddled with it themselves. The patronising racism of lower expectations for non-white people is very progressive and has been allowed to permeate Western society like an insidious slime. You can't pick up a copy of the Guardian newspaper without getting it all over your fingers. And this kind of racism gives Islam a free pass by default, and with it the misogyny, homophobia and anti-Semitism explicitly endorsed by Islam, because, and only because, it's a religion followed mainly by brown-skinned people. It's the brown skin that makes all the difference. Progressives measure a person first and foremost by the colour of their skin, and it's the brown skin that gets Islam a free pass it doesn't deserve from racists. Contrast the way progressive racists treat Mormons, whose beliefs are equally batshit crazy. But they'll happily condemn and ridicule them in a way they wouldn't dream of doing to Muslims, and the reason is entirely to do with skin colour, as it usually is with genuine racists. You see, progressives don't really believe that non-white people are equal, or are capable of being equal on their own merits, but only in the way that a handicapped golfer is equal, artificially. They justify this racism in historical terms that no longer exist, thus condemning non-white people to carry around the values of the past forever and to always need compensating for the colour of their skin, which progressives regard as a kind of residual disability because they're racists. Traditional liberal guilt is something we're all familiar with, and even if we don't agree with it, we can sympathise, we can respect it as part and parcel of being civilised. But progressives have taken this to a whole new level, an almost religious level of toxic self-hatred, of ideological self-flagellation, a kind of original sin of being born into the first world, for which progressives can never forgive themselves or anyone else. To the progressive mentality, we are all imperialist oppressors in the West, whether we want to be or not, and everything wrong with the world is our fault by default. So when a bunch of hysterical Muslims throw a violent public tantrum because they've chosen to be offended by some ridiculous trifle, the default progressive racist response is to look around for any excuse not to hold them to account for their behaviour and to find somebody to blame and call a racist for provoking them. Progressive journalists are eager to explain away Islamic atrocities in political or economic terms while carefully ignoring the poisonous religious beliefs that actually drive them, because those poisonous beliefs make the brown people look bad, and that's terribly racist. An Islamic terrorist can stand in the street soaked in blood, quoting the Quran as justification, and progressives won't hear it because they've decided his real motivation is hostility to Western imperialism, which means we can take the blame again, thank goodness, otherwise we'd be racists. Patronising brown-skinned people in this way is what progressives are all about. It's the fundamental difference between a progressive and a genuine liberal. It's what turns the wine to vinegar. You know, I've always had time for genuine liberals because I can see that they're motivated by a sense of decency, so I can still respect them even when we disagree. But there's nothing liberal or decent about the progressive mentality, which has shown itself to be just so morally corrupt, malodorous and downright dishonourable that on the rare occasions I find myself agreeing with a progressive, it's like shaking hands with a leper. And it's more than apt that these wretched people have so thoroughly taken ownership of the word racist, what's left of it, because nobody but nobody wears it better. I've just been reading a news report about some American atheists who've been trying to get a public Christmas nativity scene removed because they say it makes them feel excluded and intimidated and offended and blah blah, blah bitty blah, boo hoo hoo. Can't you just feel the emotional trauma these poor people must be suffering? No, me neither. Oddly, however, it is still enough to make you weep. This is what happens when atheism meets political correctness. I don't know if it has a name, but then it's so ugly it doesn't really need one. And as an atheist myself, I can't help but feel horribly tainted by association. And believe me, I'm as atheist as it's possible to be. I think religion is utter nonsense, and I claim the right to criticise, ridicule and insult it as much as I like, but not the right to stamp out harmless aspects of it, which is why I'm a secularist and not a totalitarian. I have a copy of the Bible in my house because it's part of my cultural heritage, not because I think the Bible is true any more than I think that Shakespeare's plays are true, but I wouldn't be without them either. I like churches, especially the sound of church bells, and I don't want to see them bulldozed. But I do want to see the power of the church, not only bulldozed, but ground into a fine dust and buried in the deepest part of the deepest ocean on the furthest planet it's possible to find. Religion needs to be kept in check when it tries to step on people or when it tries to elbow its way into their lives uninvited. The Nativity doesn't do this. It doesn't even come close. It's part and parcel of the Christmas furniture. It's part and parcel of the culture that I and most people in the Western world were born and raised in, and it only excludes people who want to be excluded. It's not even as if it's a permanent fixture, like, say, the Ten Commandments outside a courthouse. It'll be gone in a couple of weeks. And yes, we all know that the story itself is ridiculous. The entire tableau is utterly balmy and worthy of open mockery and ridicule. But to claim that it sends a message of intimidation and exclusion and therefore must be banned is both infantile and sinister, and it simply isn't true. Yes, some people may choose to be offended, but some people are offended by anything, and frankly, they can go to hell. We get this crap every year though. If it's not from atheists, it's from leftist academics or some other equality Nazis who hate their own culture so much they can't wait to abolish it. This time last year, I remember linking to a story which at the time I thought was the most outrageous piece of social manipulation I'd seen for a while, where some idiots at a Canadian university, social psychologists they call themselves, I don't know what it means either, so I looked it up and I'm still none the wiser, but I'll be willing to bet that if all the social psychologists on the planet were to disappear in a puff of smoke, nobody would be worse off. Anyway, these clowns concluded from their scientific research that Christmas trees should be removed from public places because they make non-Christians feel, guess what? Excluded. And this inevitably damages their emotional well-being. Well, of course it does. How awful for them, and doubtless this also makes them feel terribly offended, not to mention intimidated and insulted and threatened, and, or let's not forget, marginalised. It sounds like a fate worse than death, doesn't it? Except it's not true, because I'm a non-Christian. I couldn't be more non-Christian if I was from Mars. And I can tell you that I don't feel in the least bit excluded or intimidated or threatened or marginalised by Christmas trees or carol singers or nativity scenes or any other Christian aspect of a traditional Christmas. I expect to see these things in the public square where they belong. Indeed, I insist upon it. And if they're not there, if they've been removed because some self-righteous atheist fanatic or some finger-wagging diversity fascist has chosen to be offended and get the plug pulled, that's when I feel excluded and marginalised and intimidated and insulted and terribly, terribly offended. And all this inevitably plays absolute havoc with my emotional well-being. So please, militant atheists and cultural masochists alike, please do me and everyone else a favour. Leave Christmas alone for Christ's sake and stop making fools of yourselves.